So, Sam, are you excited about Yom HaAtzmaut later this week?
I am very excited. I can't wait to barbecue in honor of our independence.
It's going to be wonderful. What else are you excited about that has to do with Yom HaAtzmaut?
Well, it's funny you should ask, but this episode of our parenting podcast is dedicated to navigating the challenges faced and the opportunities faced by parents and families making Aliyah.
What a wonderful topic for
And
this
so
week.
germane to Yom HaAtzmaut.
Indeed. Hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome back to Two Peas in a Pod. In the pod? It's a pod.
Well, it's our pod.
Yeah, it's nice.
Our cozy little pod.
Very homey. Welcome back.
Yeah.
Looking forward to hanging out with you, both you, Sam,
Yeah.
and the listeners for the next bit.
Yeah.
Today we have a topic that is of personal relevance to both of us, but also to our children, unlike all the other topics that we speak about, which are purely theoretical, which is making Aliyah, moving to a different country, and also not just in terms of the moving, but also in terms of being or living in a culture different from the one that perhaps you as a parent were brought up in.
And we've done this in my family a number of times because we moved from England to Israel, and then from Israel to America, and then from America back to Israel. And each of these moves involved something of a culture shock for our children and for our family.
Yeah, for us as well. I remember as a child, we moved around a lot. I lived as a child both in Israel and in England, in addition to America. And I remember...
And as a parent too. As a parent too,
it was funny because I remember as a teen vowing to myself, I will never do such a thing when I'm a parent. And then as a parent, I've lived in Israel and England.
Yeah.
Not in America, but visited.
Yeah, but as an American, living in England as an English person, living in England as an American are very different things.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
That's a good point. So yeah,
All right.
looking forward to talking about this today.
Yeah. Okay, so here's the Torah corner. I wanted to share this notion. It's very well known. It's very famous about Torah, really, of Rabbi Soloveitchik, who focuses on Abraham's description of himself when he seeks to purchase a plot of land in which to bury his wife. He says, "Anochi ger v'toshav imachem." I am a resident alien with you, because it uses these two words, ger v'toshav. So that's being an alien and a resident alien. And Rabbi Soloveitchik, in his Chamesh Drashot, in his 5 drashot that he gave as president of World Mizrahi, the religious Zionist organization, he said, and here's a quote, "Abraham's definition of his dual status as a resident alien, we believe, describes with profound accuracy the historical position of the Jew who resides in a predominantly non-Jewish society. He was a resident, like other inhabitants of Canaan, sharing with them a concern for the welfare of society, digging wells and contributing to the progress of the country in loyalty to its government and institutions. Here, Abraham was clearly a fellow citizen, a patriot among compatriots, joining others in advancing the common welfare. However, there was another aspect, the spiritual, in which Abraham regarded himself as a stranger. His identification and solidarity with his fellow citizens in the secular realm did not imply his readiness to relinquish any aspects of his religious uniqueness. His was a different faith, and he was governed by perceptions, truths, and observances which set him apart from the larger faith community. In this regard, Abraham and his descendants would always remain strangers." In the context of the drasha he's giving, bizarrely perhaps, he relates to the religious Zionists as gerim v'toshavim within the larger Zionist community, because on the one hand, they shared in bonds of real fraternity. I mean, because they're not just share a political agenda, they're Jews, they're all common Jews. But Rabbi Soloveitchik also had this famous distinction that he uses in Kol Didofek, between a covenant of fate and a covenant of destiny. The covenant of fate binds Jews just by dint of their shared fate, irrespective of the content of their personality or their aspirations. Whereas the covenant of destiny binds Jews who buy in, and only the Jews that buy in. So he saw himself as a religious Zionist, as a ger v'toshav, a toshav because his fellow Jews, it doesn't matter if they're secular or religious, he's bound to them. But as a ger, because unlike the majority of the Zionists, he was not secular, and they were rabidly secular, and he was religious. And though what Rabbi Soloveitchik was focusing on was a distinctive feature of living as a Jew in exile, he said because the Jew who historically was predominantly surrounded by non-Jews was historically characterized as a ger v'toshav, a resident alien. What strikes me as interesting is that Abraham isn't in exile when he says these words. He is a minority. He's the only Jew in the world at the time, he and his wife, and he's talking to the Gentiles, B'nai Chet, but he's in the land of Israel. And then, as if to underline this point, when the Jewish people are about to enter the land of Israel to become sovereign as a majority, as a nation in their own land, a sovereign nation in their own land, God says to them in Parshat Emor, in the book of Vayikra, he says, you cannot sell pieces of land into perpetuity, because the most you can do is sell a freehold for 50 years. And after 50 years, it goes back to its ancestral owners. And God says, why? He says, Gerim v'toshavim atem imadi ki li haaretz. He says, you are resident aliens with me because the land is mine. And here, God is taking Abraham's self-description and he appropriates it. And he says, this is how I want you to view yourselves, even in the land of Israel, even in the land of Israel. So what I take from this, and here I'm very much informed by Franz Rosenzweig, and I should point out that Franz Rosenzweig wasn't anti-Zionist, but I don't think that this particular insight requires, God forbid, any anti-Zionism whatsoever. What Rosenzweig says is that the Jew shouldn't feel totally at home anywhere in the world, because in Chutz La'aretz we're not at home because Israel is our homeland. But when we're here in the land of Israel, unlike the homelands of other peoples, perhaps, our homeland is a holy land. And what that means is it belongs to God. So that in Chutz La'aretz, we're not at home because we're not at home. And when we're in Israel, we're not completely at home because we're living in a holy place, a place that we shouldn't feel that we have a complete possession over. We should feel as Gerim v'toshavim. We should feel as resident aliens on God's land. And I think that I found this Dvar Torah, this insight, to be somewhat helpful to me, because I often feel, and we'll speak about this perhaps in Practical Corner, in the Psychology Corner, and the key word for the Philosophy Corner is going to be this word alienation. I often feel somewhat alienated from my surroundings. I'm not a native Hebrew speaker. My Hebrew is really bad, so I feel like I'm a stranger in my own homeland. I don't feel completely at home in Chutz La'aretz. England has changed a lot since the 15 years ago when I left it. And when I lived in America, I was like that song by Sting, an Englishman in New York, a legal alien. And you feel an alien as an English person in America. And then I realized, wow, the Bible has two words for living in a place, ger v'toshav, right? Leishav is still used in modern Hebrew, but only really for sitting down. It's not used for dwelling in a place. We call a town a yishuv, and you call people yishuvim as a toshav, and a person can be and vim, residence. But if you were to describe yourself as living somewhere, you would say ani gar there. The word that we use predominantly to describe where we live is the word that translates more directly to stranger or alien, or the word.
Yeah, Chazal, when they talk about lagur b'Mitzrayim, that's when we went down to Egypt, we went there
lagur, not
to dwell there, and they point out how we did not, right, in Haggadah every year, that we did not go down to become connected to the land.
But I think it's no coincidence that modern Hebrew, it's in a sense, the biblical Hebrew has these two words, leishev and lagor. Both of them can mean to dwell in a place. It's strange that the word lagor could mean to dwell in a place because it literally has something to do with alienation. It's often translated into English Bibles as sojourn because the Latin of sojourn literally means for less than a day, although that's not how it's used in English, sojourn, but it shows you a kind of a fleeting connection to a place, sojourning. Of course, in Parshat Vayeshev, it says Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz migurei aviv, using both of our verbs, saying that Jacob tried to settle in the land where his father had sojourned. And indeed, the Midrash criticizes Yaakov for trying to be merely a toshav rather than a ger toshav. A ger toshav is someone who feels at home in the land, is willing to protect its sovereignty, to fight as we have, God should have mercy on us, but we've had to fight so often to protect our rights over this piece of land. And we do that as toshavim, but we're gerim v'toshavim. And I think that the fact that Hebrew uses this word, where are you a stranger right now? Oh, I'm a stranger in Netanya right now. Ephra tagal. Oh, I need gal b'Netanya. Almost wants to sanctify or redeem this notion that, do you know what, if you feel somewhat alienated from your surroundings, maybe that's not so bad. Maybe that allows you to have a critical distance from what's going on around you, to see what's good and to see what's less good in what goes around, and not to be a sheep that just blindly follows the trends around one, but to have a critical distance. Of course, and the reason I say Rosenzweig's anti-Zionism is not relevant here is I sometimes feel that Rosenzweig, he leans too heavily into being a ger, as if that's the only thing to be. We're only alienated. No, Rabbi Soloveitchik's point is we're both at once, a ger and a toshav. And that is a way of being that I think is not merely describing the Jew in exile, but as God says in Sefer Vayikra, describes even the Jew who has made Aliyah, and perhaps especially the Jews who've made Aliyah rather than the Jews who were born, who had the zchut to be born in Israel.
So put a lot of philosophy in there, but I want to just...
There's a Torah, though.
It's a very interesting idea.
You know.
I want to just mention two points in terms of that. Firstly, it sounds very,
Soloveitchian, because it's got this dialectic, this tension.
The dialectic, the constant tension, and 3 points, or maybe 2. Right. So number 1, in terms of the rabbinic criticism of Yaakov for wanting to dwell, vayeshev, right, wanting to lashevet.
I call it settling down.
I would suggest that. So I would suggest just that perhaps one can understand the Midrash differently, instead of viewing it as criticism, to soften that slightly and say that what Chazal were saying when they were saying that Yaakov wanted leishev b'shavah, I think we maybe quoted this recently also in another episode, was that they're viewing it as in an understanding light. Right, it's understandable that Yaakov would want to do it, but
that's not life.
But that's not always God's
especially
plan,
for the tzaddikim,
for tzaddikim in this world, and that I think that there are also other viewpoints in terms of what Bnei Israel's, what the Jewish people's position is meant to be in the land of Israel, because it is often described in terms of the vision, at least, of what it's supposed to be in these idyllic tones, right? Everyone, everyone's enjoying the fruits of the land, and things are calm. V'yishaftem ve'in macharid v'yishaftem, right? Ve'in macharid, right? You will dwell there, and there won't be in the blessings before the rebuke that we'd spoken about in the past.
But to put this back in the context of Rav Soloveitchik is sometimes criticized by some of his peers and even Talmidim for thinking that the religious life was irreconcilably riven with conflict, internal conflict. But I think what you're pointing to, Aaron, is the ideal, which is the Messianic age. But a Soloveitchikian could respond and say, yes, in the end of history, there will be a time where everyone can dwell under their own fig tree and what's the other te'ina and vine and fig tree. And we long for that day. But in the pre-messianic history in which we find ourselves, we may be called upon to be both Gerim v'Toshavim, Kili Haaretz. But I accept that there are other perhaps less angst-ridden philosophies out there in the Jewish world.
But the last point is that I think that although one could disagree with, rebel, not identify with that description of tension, perhaps paradoxically there is, for myself, like a certain level of comfort in recognizing that tension, right? In other words, saying, "Oh, I don't feel at home," but
maybe that's
okay.
the Jewish way.
Maybe I'm not supposed to feel super comfortable.
Honestly, Aaron, that's the reason I share it with the listeners, because I have taken some comfort from that, saying, "Oh, this is just to be a Jew before the Mashiach's come. That's okay." So yeah, if it works for you, I'm happy to have offered it.
Psychology Corner.
I wanted to start off with some theory and then talk about some practical psychology, but separate from the practical corner. I wanted to talk about one theory that I actually first encountered, not in psychology, but in sociology. It's a researcher, I actually don't know what his background is, but named John Berry, Berry, and he writes about 4 different acculturation strategies that usually immigrants can choose from when they come to a new country. The 4 strategies are integration, separation, assimilation, and marginalization. So I'll speak about what each of those are. Separation is when you have either an individual or a group of immigrants, or I guess it would be more in terms of a group. That's where the sociological aspect comes in. But a group of immigrants that decides we are now moving from country X to country Y. But from our perspective, we're going to make a mini country X within country Y. Right? We're going to live next to our neighbors. We're going to our fellow countrymen and women. Right? We're going to still have the values, the way of life, the education is going to reflect as much as possible what we're used to, what we brought from our home country. Right? And we have this reflected somewhat in the various neighborhoods in various cities around the world. Right? Oh, Little Italy, Chinatown. Right? The Jewish neighborhood. In other words, that these communities that we stick together, okay, fine, very nice. There's a culture that's foreign to us going on inside, but that's not ours, right? We have our own culture. So that's called separation. The opposite, I guess, of that is like 4 quadrants is assimilation, where what the individual or group would do is we'll say, okay, what was relevant in wherever, Poland, India, whatever, was good for there, but now we're not that anymore, right? Now we're Israeli, now we're American, now we're British, and sort of abandoning the original culture. Both of those strategies have certain strengths to them, but they also have potential drawbacks on the individual and the collective level, right? Abandoning one's culture, one could feel like a stranger in terms of what you were speaking about, or one could feel a stranger in the opposite direction, right? That you're sort of living in a new country, but you're not connected to it at all, and it could have negative effects potentially on the larger culture. And then the 2 last ones, I'll start with marginalization, is where an immigrant would feel connected neither to their original culture or to the new one, right? Which also, that's definitely, I don't think anyone would disagree, that's probably the worst of all outcomes. Right? A person who moves to a new country, they have no connection with where they came from, and yet they're not successful at integrating into the new culture. So they're going to be the most vulnerable overall from any of the other groups. And then the 4th strategy of integration is where one, has their cake and eats it too. Potentially, we might think it's the best of the strategies, right? Where basically where a person still takes aspects of their original culture, but also learns to adopt aspects of the new culture. And there's many different ways that one could potentially do integration, and it's not without its own aspects of difficulty and hardship and tension. It's also not necessarily always the healthiest thing. Perhaps in a big picture sense, it is, but not always on the individual level. So I wanted to talk about these 4 strategies because it's important to be aware of them, first and foremost. Right? As immigrants, as people who've come to a new country, we need to be aware of the fact that there are a number of different ways that we could potentially aim to adapt. And beyond being aware about it, you need to think about what your own strategy is, right? Whoever is listening to this might now be looking at their past or their present thinking, oh, am I more of integrationist, separation, right? Assimilation? How exactly do I feel? What strategies have I chosen? And the strategies can change over time also. But I remember when I was, I think it was after the army, I decided I want to be more Israeli. And what I did, I changed my wardrobe. I went and I had been dressing as a very much a Chutz person. And then I said, no, from now on, sandals, t-shirts, certain types of trousers. And that lasted a few months.
Yeah, I didn't know that iteration of Aaron.
Oh, yes. He was
very cool.
No, I don't know. But, right, so that's also very relevant to that age also, trying on different identities we've spoken about in the past as well. And sometimes it can be stages, and sometimes it could be sort of like rapid shifting from one strategy to the other. Or it could be at certain points you feel, I need to do this kind of strategy or the other. And the awareness of that it's also important because it could potentially be different between spouses too. Right? It could be like an implicit or underlying assumption that one or the other spouse has. So it's important to talk about. It could be one of them feels more comfortable with either the original culture or the new culture. So that could create complications. And it could also potentially create conflict with children as well in a number of ways. Because parents who move, in general, right, the majority of parents that might move to a new country and act as immigrants, so they usually feel a stronger connection to where they came from than their children. If their children were young when they moved, their children were born in the new country. And overall, they're more likely to feel this, pull towards separation / pull towards their original culture. But children are growing up in a culture that is different. So that gap sometimes can cause distress for children when a family moves to a place that's more apart from things, right? If you have talking about immigrants that move to a community where there are people like them because they feel more comfortable, more understood, it's the type of place that they're looking for. So there's a lot of benefits to that on the one hand, but that can also delay potentially their children's acculturation, in which case they might experience culture shock later on in life, right? No small amount of people that I've met professionally or personally who immigrated to Israel as children, sometimes even born here, right, and say, oh, I never really felt Israeli until I got to the army. Right? People who live,
I would say,
almost their entire lives here.
Maybe this is more relevant to bring up in the practical corner, but certainly one of my children found that there to be a kind of cultural dissonance between the Judaism they received in their Jewish schooling and the Judaism they received in their home and in our very Anglo bubble community, because North American and English-speaking modern Orthodoxy is not exactly the same in terms of its ethos and emphases as Israeli Torani religious Zionism. And it wasn't so much what you're describing, perhaps this delayed culture shock because the children have been insulated, so much as a kind of a long-term dissonance between what they're feeling at home or receiving at home and what they're feeling and receiving in school. Some of our children have found that less uncomfortable, and one of them in particular found it very difficult, I think.
Yeah. We'll talk definitely more about that in the practical corner. We've definitely experienced that and that as well. But I think that part of it is also in terms of the question of in what areas does the gap exist,
mm-hmm.
right? Because we do have a cultural barrier, which encompasses a lot of different things. There's one aspect of it is about just the way things are. So what does the first day of school look like? Right. So in Israel, the first day of school is a festive day. Everyone knows you're supposed to be wearing a white shirt, and you have an immigrant family. Okay, first day, right? Very nice. But they're not. What's all this music? Why is there balloons? Why are people dancing? Oh, I didn't know you're supposed to bring a white shirt. What's going on? That's just one tiny example. There's hundreds of other ones in terms of just the way things are. But over and above that, right, in terms of perhaps what's more central to a culture in terms of values, in terms of what are the values, and in terms of the hierarchy of values and how the values interact with reality. So part of what you were speaking about, you didn't get into, I think, the nitty gritty of the details, but I have had a number now of conversations with our oldest daughter recently about what one's emotional viewpoint should be or ought to be in terms of war and being victorious at war and having our enemies be killed or evil people be killed, right? So there is the predominant message, perhaps, from the religious community here in Israel is, "Yay, awesome! This is great," right? And that's there's shared a number of times from school where various things, right, have received cheers and clapping and just unbridled joy, and that's something that clashed with her own sense of what's right and what's proper and the value of human life. So, which partially is her own set of values, but also partially in terms
she's
of
received from her home.
what we talk about at home. Yeah. So in terms of navigating that's challenging, right? So recognizing the difference, the dissonance you spoke about, and also learning to navigate that. And language is also a huge aspect of it as well, right? When I say language, it's both the actual spoken language, but also the unspoken aspects of language as well. And the language can make it more difficult for children to adjust, right? When they don't know the language of the country in which they're living. But even when they do, it's not necessarily so easy on a family level either, because of the fact that overall immigrant parents will speak the new language less good. No, that's not English. But they'll speak their language levels will be lower than their children's language levels over time, usually. And that can sometimes lead to a role reversal, right? Where children are more adept at handling society. And then all of a sudden you could potentially have a situation where a parent who's more separatist will be like, I can't call the credit card company. Here, you call the credit card company, right? To your 14-year-old, which is not something that 14-year-olds should be doing. I mean, not that it's inappropriate, just in terms of the role reversal, right? Who's the capable one, who can get things done, who's the protect, right? What the roles are in the family. So that can create familial challenges as well. It's not exactly the same as when a parent is dealing with a disability, but it's not always that far removed from it, right? I remember sometimes, I think it never happened in the end, but when a parent, let's say, is not able to hear or is blind, right? So that can sometimes put more responsibility on the child to help the parent navigate the world, which can also be a role reversal. I think about this example from
trivial examples, like when I'm going shopping with one of the kids and I need to ask where something is and I don't know the word, I'll ask my kid for translation. But it does mean that you're relying on your children for things in the normal run of events a parent wouldn't rely on one's children for.
Yeah. And that can be hard on a personal level. Like, how can I admit weakness or lack of knowledge in front of my children? It's important to have humility on the one hand and be authentic and open, but you also want your children to feel that they can rely on you and that you're capable, not just in terms of your own self-image, but it's also important for children to feel at some stages and in some ways that their parents are capable people.
My poor children are capable. I don't know. Anyway, yes, go on. You're going to share.
This television show in Israel called Nevsu. This is part of the cultural gap. I don't know what's going on in Israeli pop culture, all sorts of other things. But there was this one show, I think because it made it on Netflix probably, it's called Nevsu. I don't know if it's still going on, but it was this story about this family that's this Ethiopian man marrying an Ashkenazi woman.
I've seen it.
Right, so all these humorous cultural differences and shocks, whatever, some more out there. But there was this one part where one of the female teenagers was from the Ethiopian side of the show was teaching her uncle about the way that you need to interact with different companies in Israel, right? If you want to get a lower price, you don't say, "Oh, I want a lower price." You say, "I'm going with a different company," and then you hang up, right? And then they call back and say, "Oh, now we'll give you a better offer," right? That's the way you do things in Israel, which is not something you do. I mean, no, I don't know about Ethiopian credit card companies, how they work, but it's not something we're used to in America either. And so he was doing this. He was so proud of himself. He kept calling everyone up, getting better deals. And then all of a sudden, she hears him on the phone with the electric company, right? Chevrat Chashmal, and he's making the same threats. And she's, "No, stop! What are you doing?" But it's too late. He ends the call, and 2 seconds later, the electricity to his apartment is shut off. And she says, "In Israel, you never mess with the electric company, right? The Chevrat Chashmal, you don't want to get on their bad side." So that's one example of this cultural conflict. And in terms of partially to do with values, but just some specific gaps that I wanted to mention with regards to Israeli culture versus I wouldn't call it Chutzla'aretz culture because there's so many different Chutzla'aretzes that we're also just not familiar with on a personal level. And I think there's a difference in America and England also, our own two personal experiences. But I think perhaps what is common to some of those Chutzla'aretz cultures that we're familiar with and to Israel and the conflict between them. So one of them, I try to phrase them in a positive way. One is the stress put on independence versus oversight, that in Israel, independence is very strongly valued, and that people coming from Chutzla'aretz might feel at some points that children are being thrown to the wolves, or that there's, what's hazmacha in English? No one's looking after the kids. The English word is failing me right now. Not abandonment, but not far from that. Whereas in America, right, or England also, right, they want oversight. We want to make sure that everything's okay, safeguarding, right? And in Israel, that's discounted as infantilizing your children. Another conflict is collective responsibility versus individual development, right? How much do you need to care about the klal, about the group, or how much do you need to focus on making sure that you're moving forward, that you're okay? And related to that sort of is like a respect for personal boundaries versus connection, right? And a new immigrant coming to Israel will be shocked by the questions they're asked. How much do you make? How much, who did you vote for? What's your rent? How much you buy the apartment for? When's the last time you fought with your mother? Like a whole long list of things, right? As a turnoff. And like from Israeli's perspective, no, that's just how we connect with people. That's how we build the sense of connection. Why are you so closed off? Why are you acting like you're better than us? Don't want to share. What's wrong with you? Another potential clash is wanting to be tough versus the sense of gentleness, and that there is overall a greater value placed on toughness, I think, in Israel. Somewhat related to what I spoke about before, but obliqueness in communication versus being direct. Right? So this is slightly different also in terms of
because the English are much more oblique than the American.
Indirect. Very true. Very true. So in terms of some of these conflicts, cultural conflicts, so we as immigrants need to learn to adjust, to change. But there's points that we just need to be aware of them so that we don't get overly distressed by it. And sometimes we can note this conflict and use it to try and make a difference. Yeah. Right? To say, not just say, oh, this is the way things are in Israel, so get over it. But this is the way things are in Israel, and it makes sense that they are this way. But that
they always have to be.
That they have to be this way, and that they should be, and maybe they should. Maybe I can make a slight difference in the world. And I remember during my course of study in psychology, we had a couple classes on multiculturalism. So there was a very wide group of people in the program, which was very interesting for me on a personal level. So I spoke a little bit about the culture that I grew up in, and the professor said afterwards, he gave his whole spiel about everything that I'd said, and he said, for example, like Aaron will need to learn to be more assertive because in his culture, right, you're supposed to be polite. So there's going to be points in the therapy room where he's going to need to tell someone, stop talking. Or you need to let me say something. But there's points where that's not always the case, right? Sorry, this is getting a little bit to the practice, and I'm already gone for so long. But I remember Naftali Bennett, I don't remember, at some point I think over the past year, wrote about his mother and about how she had encountered the term of being a friar. Right, so that about how I'd spoken about it to friends in the past. I was happy. I think he phrased it a lot better. That in Israel, right, it's very important, right? Yehereg val ya'avor, one ought to be killed instead of violating this principle. That to not have anyone ever pull over anything on you, no matter what, in any circumstances at all. And there's this pressure to make sure that you never become a friar. If you do, you'll get made fun of mercilessly, right? You'll be on the lowest rung of the totem pole, whatever it is. And she learned about this as an immigrant, right, from America. Yeah, America. And she said, the descriptions you're giving to a friar, right, someone who's trusting, who's optimistic, who's honest, who believes in others, they sound so nice. Yeah. I want to be a friar, right? That sounds amazing. And I think as someone who grew up in a different culture, that's an important value also to say, right? To say I would rather have an outlook in life in which I trust and believe people as the default, without even though I may lose out on things from time to time.
And actually, that can be
Okay.
one of the
You know, I don't-
contributions that we make to Israeli society as Olim. And
Yeah,
there's a phrase that gets used in all sorts of contexts, galuti. That's so galuti, so diasporic. And there's a whole history. I wrote a paper on the philosophy of Zionism, and I did some research into the history of this notion, the Israeli conception of the exile and the exilic Jew, the diasporic Jew. And there's a whole history as to how that took on its many different layers of negative nuances. That's so galuti. But I don't think that every Oleh has to accept that everything that gets characterized as galuti is necessarily bad. And if, in fact, as believing Jews, we might think that the galut itself had a purpose, and there were some things we were supposed to learn in the 2,000 years in exile, and bring them to bear and bring them to fruition in our life in Israel. So yes, on this issue, I'm with Naftali Bennett's mother that sometimes we're the ones that have to change. Clearly, right? We have to acculturate, acclimatize. But certainly on the issues of the key values that matter most to us, I think sometimes we can see it as our contribution to Israeli society that we're not necessarily willing to forego some of those values.
Yeah. Galuti is like one of those words that just is so denigrates so much that it like ends the conversation. It's like Smolani.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not someone has more left wing versus right wing, but it's Smolani.
And then just written them off.
Just ignore it.
And you do that with Galuti, and it's a shame. Yeah. All right.
The Philosophy Corner.
So I'm going to branch out a little bit into philosophers that I wouldn't normally be associated with. I've done that more than once in this show, though, in our piece in the pond. I think it might be to do with the topics we've chosen. But I'm going to speak about this notion of alienation as it enters into philosophy, predominantly through Karl Marx. Hegel, who was a massive anti-Semite, but apart from that, Hegel was a massive influence over Karl Marx. And Hegel thinks that politics begins with, or if it doesn't begin with, it certainly is a crucial element of the political sphere of life, is the demand that each individual has for recognition. We all want to be recognized. And what that means is we want to be understood by others as a subject. There's this very nice idea encapsulated in the Hebrew language. The Jews are described as Ishon Einav, as the pupil of God's eye. That's sometimes translated as the apple of God's eye in order to give it some idiomatic content, right? But it literally means the pupil of God's eye. And the Hebrew word for pupil, Ishon, is itself a very beautiful notion, because it more literally means little man, and Ishon. And the reason the word pupil means little man is because if you look in someone's eyes, you see the reflection of yourself. You see a little man in the eye of those you look into.
That's a fascinating etymological
point. Well, there you
point.
go. Thank you. I like to leave our listeners with some new piece of knowledge, a new nugget. So yes. So
in England, in English or psychology, the little man is in your brain.
Interesting.
That's the homunculus.
The homunculus. That's right. The little man. Yeah, the homunculus.
Yeah.
But the idea here that Hegel brings to the table is that we each actually want to see ourselves reflected in the eyes of another. That's to say, we want to be looked upon as subjects, not to be treated as objects, not to be treated as means to an end, but to be understood as people. And that's a very key aspect of what we require from society. And a just society is one that kind of distributes this recognition widely, so that as many people as possible feel recognized.
There's a whole field of psychology that focuses on that aspect called intersubjective psychology.
Interesting. So in Jewish philosophy, this comes out very strongly in Buber and Rosenzweig, who I've mentioned already today, and in Franz Levinas. Buber obviously talks a lot about, he's well known because he has a book called I and Thou, right? So Buber talks about different ways a person can relate to another. There are I-it relationships where you have a relationship with just an object, and there's an I-thou relationship where you meet another person as a subject. There's a key philosophical question is, where does obligation come from? Where does the notion of chiyuv, or in English the word ought, what is the source of obligations? And the puzzle is, it seems like you can never derive an ought from an is. This is the way that the problem is often phrased in analytical philosophy. It goes back to Hume, and G.E. Moore calls it the naturalistic fallacy, where you try to derive an ought from an is. Let me give you an example. You might say, well, my son's a vegetarian, therefore he ought not to eat meat. But actually that doesn't follow. It only follows if he ought to be a vegetarian. And I can make this clearer to you. The fact that he is a vegetarian doesn't entail that. It would only entail that if he ought to be a vegetarian. Then it would follow that he ought not to eat meat. Let me give you an example that will, I think, clarify this. Jack the Ripper is a murderer, but that doesn't mean he ought to murder, right? Just the fact that he is something doesn't entail that he ought to be something. And in fact, Jack the Ripper is a murderer, but he ought not to be. And the idea here is that ought claims don't come out of is claims. They only come out of other ought claims. So again, my son is a vegetarian. That doesn't imply that he ought not to eat meat. It only implies that he ought not to eat meat if he ought to be a vegetarian, right? The real question is, should he be a vegetarian? And then if he should, then he shouldn't eat meat. And if he shouldn't, then he should eat meat. Anyway, the puzzle is, where does obligation come from, right? Where does it...
Just in terms of that vegetarian, right? In other words, I would say that there's still a... I mean, what you were speaking about was in terms of identity. Do I identify as a vegetarian or as a ripper?
Yeah.
And then, but then I think in the ought part has to do with a lot of different values, right? Is murder good, not of animals, but of people, right? And also is living a life that's in integrity with one's values.
Good.
Is that
so you could say, well, if he calls himself a vegetarian and he eats meat, then he's being inconsistent. He's not living a life of integrity. But okay, but that's because you've got a hidden premise here, which is that people ought to be consistent. So again, the ought is only coming from another ought. It's not coming from the naturalistic fallacy.
A combination.
Right,
because a carnivore ought to eat meat. Right?
That's right. The fact that he's a vegetarian, plus the fact that people ought to be consistent, equals that he ought to be. So yes, there's no doubt that ethics has to take non-ethical facts into consideration. But the point of the naturalistic fallacy is that you can't conclude a moral fact from a non-moral fact. Moral facts don't tumble out of non-moral facts. So where do they come from? And what this Jewish Hegelian, broadly speaking, tradition, Buber, Rosenzweig, and Levinas, they all say is that somehow it's almost mystical. The ought dimension of life emerges from the space between two people. When a person looks at another person and experiences them as a you rather than an it, poof, out of nowhere emerges this thing called obligation, which is that I have to respect your integrity, I have to respect your dignity, I just feel it. Rosenzweig puts it this way: the law book says, thou shalt love the Lord thy God, right? Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all that. And Rosenzweig is like, well, you can't command me to love you. That doesn't seem to make any sense. I either love or I don't. Love isn't something I can switch on like a switch. But says Rosenzweig, yes, when another human being looks you in the eye, or in this case, another person looks you in the eye, somehow in that context, it can somehow make sense to say that their gaze calls upon you to love them. Think about your beautiful little child looking up at you with wide eyes, right? They're calling upon you to love them. And though it makes no sense to command love in a law book, in the context of interpersonal relations, one person can call another person to love them. Levinas says you read obligation off the face of another. When you really experience another as a person, then you feel commanded just automatically. You feel obligated.
But from where? From where?
So yeah, so it is something like magic. The idea is that I think this is something that's forced on us by the notion of the naturalistic fallacy, is that ultimately at some point you're just going to have to say you're obligated because you are. You just are. Damn it, right? Shut up if you ask another why question. At some point, all investigations have to bottom out into just axioms. But at least what Buber, Rosenzweig, and Levinas give us is they say, yeah, but I can show you where it happens, and it begins between people. If there was only one person, they would say, there'd be no such thing as obligation. It's only because there's more than one person, and they think as God as a person too, as a personal being. But the idea is it's only when there's more than one person that this intersubjectivity emerges, where you get a space between two people. That's where ethics begins, according to these thinkers. Now, what does this have to do with our topic about making Aliyah and being acculturated? Well, where Karl Marx goes with some of these trains of thought is he has a critique of capitalism. And his critique is as follows. If you are a worker on the factory floor and and all you do is you screw in some cog on a car and then it moves past you, and then you screw it in another cog in the same place on another car, and then another car goes by and you screw in a cog. At no point do you feel invested in the fruits of your labor. In fact, you never get to see the completed article, right? You're just, you become much like a cog in a machine yourself. He talks about this as a process in which the worker becomes alienated from the fruits of their labor. And there's this beautiful passage. Karl Marx actually, I don't know if people know this, but he could turn a phrase. And he has this passage where he describes what it would be like in his version of utopia, where let's imagine that you need a nice new chair to sit on. And you know that I'm a good carpenter, so you bring me some wood, and I know what you need, so I carve my chair for you, and I give you the chair, and you get a lot of satisfaction from it. You might even give me money for this. We don't have to be that communist that there's no money involved. But he says like this is the quote: "Let us suppose that we'd carried out production as human beings rather than alienated people. Each of us would have in two ways affirmed himself and the other person. One, in my production, I would have objectified my individuality, its specific character, and therefore enjoyed not only an individual manifestation of my life during the activity, but also when looking at the finished object, I'd have the individual pleasure of knowing my personality to have been made objective, visible to the senses, and hence a power beyond all doubt. And two, in your enjoyment or use of my product, I would have the direct enjoyment both of being conscious of having satisfied a human need by my work, that is, of having objectified man's essential nature, and of having thus created an object corresponding to the need of another man's essential nature." Here comes the beautiful part. He says, "Our products would be so many mirrors in which we saw reflected our essential nature." I think it's such a beautiful idea. And in Torah Judaism, there's this idea of uman koneh b'shevach kli, right? So in Judaism, in Jewish law, if we did this transaction, Aaron, you gave me the wood and I made the chair, what you pay me for is not merely my labor, but you pay me for the fact that I have, by improving the wood and making it into a chair, I've mixed some of myself into it. And even though I gave you no money, I've become a partner in the chair. And what you pay me for in Jewish law is you buy me out of the chair because I've put some of myself into it. And what Marx is saying is that there are some ways that society can be organized in which we never get to see ourselves reflected in others. We never get to see ourselves reflected in the things we've made, in the relationships we have. It's as if we never get to see our reflection in the eye of another. We never get treated like a you by people. And that's what alienation is, I think. And even though I'm not a Marxist, I'm not a communist, I think there's something profound about that. And that, I think, is what Olim would do well to escape. They would do well to escape that feeling of not being understood, not being seen, not being recognized. And that's an experience that you can only have, so to speak, when you see yourself reflected in the pupil of another who looks at you without objectifying you. And especially in the process of becoming an Oler, there's so much foreign bureaucracy. And I think there's very little that can make a person feel like a number and an object and unlike a person better than a faceless bureaucracy. And there's a lot of that, and especially when it's not in your native tongue.
Sometimes a face-full bureaucracy might be even worse, right? If you feel like you're interacting with a human, and then just lumped in with a whole group that's not understood.
But if bureaucracy is done by people who actually listen to you and smile at you and understand your unique situation, right? No, it's much better. It's hard. Yeah.
Oh, but I'm saying, like, if it's face-full, but still there's that aspect of not the reflection is not of you, but of their own preconceived notions.
Yes, I hear what you mean.
Perhaps.
So in this philosophy corner, what I wanted to give is a diagnosis of a problem that we want to avoid, and that problem can be called alienation. And I think philosophers have interesting things to say about what it is and where it emerges.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Sam. I wanted to a couple of additional points just in response to some of the things you mentioned. So I'll go in reverse order. In terms of what you were speaking about with regards to Marx and that feeling of alienation, you quoted also the idea that we have halachically also about this idea of uman koneh b'shevach kli, that a craftsman acquires a part of a utensil that he works on through just his effort, right? A part of him is in there. And I was thinking also about how a somewhat related but different source also is with regards to the prohibition of delaying a worker's wages, which is one of the negative precepts. There's both a positive and negative command, or multiple even negative commands in the Torah against withholding wages. And the Gemara, when it discusses the verses around this prohibition, it brings a debate with regards to the verse of Ve'elav hu noseh nafsho, that to this wage, he is carrying his soul. He's carrying his soul, and what exactly that means. So the Gemara in the discussion of this prohibition wants to learn the halacha that even a small amount of work, if one does not pay for that, they also violate the prohibition. So one opinion learns it from one verse, but the other opinion learns it from this verse of Ve'elav hu noseh nafsho, that he is carrying his soul for it. And the Gemara uses the phrase davar hamoser nafsho alav, that what we're referring to is one who is giving up his soul for it. The first opinion says, no, that's talking about a situation where one is actually taking on some element of risk. That he's putting his life in danger in order to do this. He's going up on a ladder, he's climbing a tree, doing all sorts of things that could potentially cause him harm. But this opinion that I'm speaking about is that he's actually giving something of his own soul into the work. Yeah. So in other words, that he's putting himself into that labor. So another connection.
Yeah. To bring this back to our topic of because this is very far away from the hour. What are we talking about? But again, it's just this idea that there's a basic human need to feel recognized, and its manifestation in work is that we don't want to have jobs that are meaningless and that don't matter to other people, and that say something about who and what we are and what our values are.
Yeah. And in terms of what you mentioned from the philosophical standpoint, so there is actually a whole field of psychology, I think maybe I mentioned earlier, called the intersubjective psychology, a whole theoretical approach, which is very much overlaps with what it is that you're saying. That I'll start with Donald Winnicott. He writes about what he calls the transitional space. That he's sort of like a pre-theoretician for this field. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's the space between my own internal reality and the external reality, right? Everyone else is on the outside, and the transitional space is this space between my own inner self and the outer reality, where it's the space where play takes place, where when a person is in connection with another, so it's sort of this shared reality that they build together, and that can be symbolic, playful, things of that sort. But then intersubjective psychology takes a step even further, where what the real stress on is on what you were saying, that there's a real shift to focus on relationships and mutual making of meaning. And one of maybe the main, but definitely one of the main thinkers is a psychologist named Jessica Benjamin, and she writes a lot about Buber as well, about how the development of self is really contingent on one's ability to recognize the other. She talks a lot about the concept of recognition, which is what we're talking about. It also very much relates to the Aliyah process as well.
So recognition goes all the way back to the key role that recognition plays in a person's self-esteem. That goes back to Hegel. But paying very careful attention to the notion of the space between two people, a you and an I and a you, that was Buber's contribution. And it fit very snugly into a Jewish context, as we've shown with the Gemaras that you cited. And these are concerns that Chazal had long before Hegel. They recognized that people needed recognition, and you could go even all the way back to Tanakh with that notion of the Hebrew word for the people of an eye, Ishon. Right? That it all seems to be written into the kind of fabric of Jewish thought. I would say that these psychological and philosophical corners are really very much an extension of the Torah corner at the beginning of which is how it should be ideally, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's interesting, right, getting into what you're saying too, in terms of how Avraham is referred to at the beginning of his appearance in the Torah, near the beginning of his appearance, that is referred to as Avram HaIvri, the Ivri, right? Wow. So one, that what that means is, right, that he came from the Ever, right? He came from the other side. In other words, that he's identified by being other, right? He was the first to make Aliyah.
Yes, that's right.
And what makes him stand out is, it's one of those.
Oh, it's one of those with the Ivri accent.
Yeah.
And the Gemara makes a virtue out of this and says, if everybody stood on one side of the river, Abraham, the iconoclast, would stand on the other side.
Right.
Right. Not just he was an Ivri not just by accident, but an Ivri on purpose. And that comes back to the part of the discussion where we're saying some of the alien nature that we bring to Israel as Olim might be a good thing. It's okay. It's okay to be an Ivri. It's a good thing to be an Ivri. It was a Shevas of Avraham that he was.
And it's possible that can also, that introduces a certain level of contrast between ourselves and others, which could be potentially mutually beneficial.
Exactly.
Because that contrast leads to a sense of potential tension, but also pushes us to both sides to better understand themselves and the other. Hopefully. I mean, it could just lead to hate and dehumanization, which is
there's a paradox
generally like to avoid.
Because we're introducing alienation as something that can really lower one's self-esteem. And we recognize the need for recognition. But we're also saying, almost paradoxically, that once one takes ownership over some elements of their alienness, it can actually boost their self-esteem. But that's okay. It's a big difference in this respect.
We're almost at the practical corner. There's just one. I just wanted to. There's one quote from Jessica Benjamin that I wanted to share, and then we could, if you have anything to say about it, you're welcome to, obviously, and then we'll do the practical stuff.
Okay.
So she wrote as follows: recognition. She writes a lot about recognition. Is that response from the other which makes meaningful the feelings, intentions, and actions of the self. It allows the self to realize its agency and authorship in a tangible way. But such recognition can only come from an other whom we, in turn, recognize as a person in his or her own right. In other words, that I need that recognition in order to have a meaningful sense of self. But that recognition is only matters if I've also given almost at the same time that recognition to the other. Because if somebody who I don't recognize as a person says, "Oh, wonderful," right? So when I use ChatGPT to sometimes talk out ideas, and when it says, "Oh, great job, you're doing great work," it's okay, like you're a computer. Like it's not meaningful to me. It's nice. It's like a little bit, but it's I sense the sense of falseness in that.
Yeah.
The practical corner.
If our listeners knew how much money we spent on those sound bites introducing the practical corner and whatever.
Yeah, lots of royalties. I mean, I think there's a self-recording, so we can license it out to others. But so we've already discussed a lot of different practical aspects, but really want to hone in on them and focus on some others also. One perhaps the central practical point, I think, is to help our children learn to be a part of both cultures. In other words, that in general, the healthiest approach psychologically of the ones that I mentioned earlier is one of integration, of learning what to take from each culture. And also, together with that, it can help us to aid our children to not take anything as what we call in Hebrew, muvan me'elav, as self-understood, as taken for granted. Self-evident. Oh, that's much better. I always look for the good translation. For a good translation, I can't write it. Self-evident, much nicer. In other words, in either culture, right? In other words, to be humble enough to not say, "Oh, back in America or in England, everything was great, and here everything is backwards." But to say, look, there's parts of me that for me are self-evident because that's how I grew up. It might not be, and who better to note it than you? Right? You as a child will have a much better hold on this contrast of understanding. Wait, why things at home are much different than I experience outside.
So what you're saying here, Aaron, as a practical answer, practical tip.
I think that when there's going to be clashes in terms of the values, the viewpoints that are at home and at school, and if you work on communication with your child, you'll be able to discuss with them those clashes. It might be something that comes up, especially
So what
mentioned earlier in terms of younger children or older children. Sorry.
What you're contributing, so to speak, is almost like not as specific as a script, but I'm thinking of like a script for such communication where you explain that what's self-evident for somebody coming from one culture might not be for another.
Yeah. And I think, but I think that it's important to hold that balance with anything when we're talking about children's developing sense of values and self and beliefs. It's like we talked earlier about our eldest, who was very bothered by some of the ways in which others are speaking about the war in school. So I could say, well, they're wrong, right? They're horrible. They're dehumanizing. They're all sorts of things. But what I try and do is explain what, try and understand with her what it was that bothered her in terms of understanding her own feelings, like shared my own also, and understanding that and how that connects to what she's saying, and also try to a little bit understand where that other viewpoint is coming from.
I think that's very difficult, and I think I just mea culpa. I think I failed so badly on that front because I think that when my children came home saying things that teachers had said that I thought were really wrong or maybe even offensive, I did not hold back, and I was like, "That's horrific! How on earth could a human being think such a thing?" Because I think the consequences of to cause a tremendous amount of dissonance between what's going on at school and what's going on at home. It kind of emphasized the difference, which probably was a an obstacle to integration. And I'm going to come back with a question to you in a moment, but before I do, I'll say, well, yeah, I'll say what you've said is we should try and contextualize maybe where those views come from, try and understand why those people are thinking those things. Here's my comeback question. What if it's a really terrible thing? The teacher said, and sure, you can contextualize it. You can say, look, they've lived through years of conflict and they've lost people that they've loved and you know, et cetera. But at the end of the day, if you think what they said was morally frightful,
well, you could say that also.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think you need to sugarcoat your own thoughts and your own positions. To say that in a position you feel is morally frightful is different, I think, than saying that there's no basis whatsoever for it either. In other words, that whether this we'll be getting into a whole nother
philosophy
topic over here, yeah. But
because I think the consequence of my showing disdain was then the child in question looked at this as the teachers as, oh, well, they're kind of stupid. My dad's already done this to me. And then that's not a good recipe for kind of fitting into a school.
Yeah. I remember I heard once from this, I don't know if it was shared in a semi-private way, so I won't say who, but I was on a course once that this big rabbi was involved with, and he shared about how his sons once came back from school, and they shared what their Rebbe had taught them about Rashi. I don't remember the exact Rashi, but something on Chumash. And he like really let it, he's like, Rebbe doesn't know what he's talking about. He's wrong. And then I learned over time after my wife spoke to me about it wasn't a good idea because they responded to their teacher in that way. And then he was talking about how
good. So, but the question back to you is, your kids in a school and you think the school is a good school, but you do think that some of the things that teachers are saying are like bordering on offensive, not just wrong. I'm interested to hear what kind of conversation would you have with a child in that circumstance?
I think that it's also important in that type of context to remember that whatever this specific issue is, that doesn't mean it doesn't necessarily color the entire corpus of education, the entire education that they're getting from that school. And I think that that's also important. That
is that something is that something you would communicate to the child as well?
I think that could be a good idea. I hadn't thought about it. It hasn't really come up as much for me as I think it has for you guys. Yeah. But I think that's another way to potentially respond to things within a broader context.
Contextualize, explain why people have come to the views they've come to, even if we don't share them, but also to say, look, what are the things you value about the school? Yeah. You know, what the things that you find difficult, what are the things you value?
To get rid of the klipa and enjoy the fruit, right? To get rid of the covering, get rid of the shell.
If I could parent again the 3 children I had, again, I'd be so much better the second time around.
That's what grandparenting is for.
Yeah.
You tell your children what they do. No, not really.
I mean, in 30 years' time, can we do a podcast about grandparenting?
Well, maybe we can interview a grandparent and already talk about grandparenting now. All right, we'll write it down on the list.
Okay. Next practical suggestion.
Okay, next practical aspect is also to be able to share with your children your own struggles about Aliyah and adjusting, and your own debates in an age-appropriate way. Right? I mean, everyone has their own situation in terms of whether they're talking about a family that made Aliyah a year ago versus people who made Aliyah and their children were born here. I think it's a very different situation. But when you struggle, you need to think about whether discussing that struggle with your children would overwhelm them, which maybe then is not as good to be as transparent to them. But on the other hand, it's possible for them to gain from it too. Their struggles might parallel yours.
Yeah, and so that you can showcase to them how one adjusts and how one navigates such difficulties. But I wanted to ask you, because you come to the psychology corner, you're mentioning that one of the things that immigrant children sometimes struggle with is that responsibilities are placed on their shoulders that wouldn't necessarily be placed on the shoulders of non-immigrant children, because they have to compensate for their parents' deficits in cultural and linguistic understanding. Do you fear that sharing your struggles as an Oleh with your children will magnify that concern, by that issue?
I think it's a good question. And I think that it could be potentially helpful to share struggles in a way that also frames it as not something that I'm overwhelmed, that I have no clue what to do. I don't see a way out of this. There's no hope, because that's usually not going to be so helpful for your children's adjustment.
But if you have a struggle that you feel you're dealing with, and that you feel, okay, this is hard, but I'm managing, maybe those are the sorts of struggles that one can productively share.
Yeah, but it could be helpful to share in ability, right? If you're feeling, this is really hard for me, and sometimes I don't know what to do, and I get stuck. But, right, and then there's a but, right? In other words, even though this I'm stuck in something else, I'm happy about, or whatever it is. So it's not, it's okay to share things that you haven't figured out yet, and that you're still struggling with.
So number one,
that you don't have a solution for, but
number one has been communicating on. Number one was communicating specifically about cultural differences. Number two has been about communicating inappropriate one's own struggles. Yes, indeed. This segued beautifully into number three, because I think there's one counting.
It does. Yeah. It's good counting.
Yeah.
So point number three is, maybe this should have been up first, is in terms of positivity. That I think it's really important for parents also to hold on to that angle of, well, why are we here in Israel, right? We're here for a reason. It's important for us to be here. It's a value. And to talk about whatever it is that each family views positively about being here in the country. And as we mentioned before, part of that positivity is also that sometimes these differences or this clash that we notice can specifically be beneficial, that it could be potentially something that we can change positively about the country in which we find ourselves.
They tend to have a day or two where they focus on Olim. And so I've gone into, when my kids were in Gan, they invite like the parent of an Oleh, a real Oleh, to come and speak about, and then we did it in primary school as well, to come and speak about what it means to come from Britain and then to move to Israel. And there's something that there's an old Israeli idiom that says Israelis hate Olim, but they love Aliyah, because they make life difficult for individual Olim, but they love Aliyah as a concept. But there is something to be proud about, that we made Aliyah. And actually, in those opportunities, when you're invited into school, you get to realize, well, we got to do a mitzvah, so to speak, that you don't get to do if you're born in Israel. We made Aliyah. Now, some of our children might be born in Israel, and therefore they didn't. But as a family, it's a family achievement that we moved from one country and put down roots in the promised land. Is something to be proud of. And I think that's right. Sometimes practical suggestions can be as theoretical as packaging things. How do you package something? And if you package some of the struggles that we have as a consequence of this amazing thing that we get to live in Israel, and thinking about what that means. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I remember, connected to that, I remember once hearing from a friend, Rabbi Judah Goldberg. I don't remember exactly how he phrased it, but if you believe that in the march of generations, that somewhere along the line, someone in the lineage is going to need to move from Chutz to Israel, and that person is going to struggle and have difficulty of all the types that we've mentioned up until now. So taking that on yourself is an act of kindness, an act of chesed for all future generations of yours. That's also, I think, a positive reframe too.
Yeah, I'm taking this one for the team. The team being, please God, all of our descendants will live happily in the land as native-born Israelis.
Yeah. Another practical suggestion is being open to potentially, I wrote differential treatment, but I'm not sure if I like that phrase. Yeah. That in general, I think the majority of Olim from English-speaking countries have a situation where they speak English at home and then Hebrew at school, but many don't. Maybe they'll have Hebrew in both places. Some also, they specifically want their children to be an English-speaking environment outside, which is connected to the separation strategy mentioned before, but it can be more challenging. But it's important to know that there are some children who would find that difficult in terms of if their language abilities are are not as developed, and they might find it difficult to develop being bilingual. And it's important to be aware of that, because it could be that for specific children, you need to just have one language.
Yeah.
You know, making that potential sacrifice of having to speak with them in Hebrew, even when they're at home.
Yeah, and some of that is just some of the challenge you're referring to is navigated merely with patience, because, for instance, if you raise a child from birth in a bilingual environment, studies show, unsurprisingly, that it takes the child longer to speak even in one or both or either of the languages. So a certain degree of patience. Although I'll share a kind of warning anecdote for the listeners, is that when we made Aliyah, our youngest was just 2.5, so it was only just beginning to flourish as an English speaker, and we sent him to Gan in Hebrew, and he was really set back with language acquisition, and we were like, well, it's natural, it's in a bilingual environment, bilingual is natural, it's bilingual. He actually had a hearing deficit, and we didn't realize. because we put the slowness in language acquisition down to the bilingual environment, when in fact there was another underlying cause. But
I think that's important too. You have to remember that not every challenge that an Oleh child experiences is related to their Aliyah.
They're not always a function of Aliyah.
Right. It's the most easiest and most frequent explanation, but it's not always accurate. So we need to hold that in mind. It's really not so easy. Yeah. But that's the helpful addition. Another practical point is in terms of maintaining a connection while, right, because often if a family moves here, so then they still have family and friends and memories back from wherever it is that they came. So that connection doesn't obviously need to be severed, and should be cherished and maintained. But you need to balance that with not making Chutzlaretz the ikar, the main point. Right? So I have some friends who, I think it was a friend, maybe it was a teacher, I don't remember, who would always, when they would go back to visit their grandparents, it wouldn't be, oh, we're going to America or visit Canada. Aren't they great? Right? But rather, it's we're going to go visit grandma and grandpa, right, or Saba and Savta, whatever we call them. Right? In other words, we're going to their home. We're not going to America. We're not going to England.
We're not going back home. We're going to grandma and grandpa's
right.
home.
Yeah.
I think that's an important piece of packaging. Although I think we're very privileged to be Jews who made Aliyah without running away. I didn't run away from Britain, and we lived for 3 years in America. We didn't run away from America. I know that being a Jew in Chutzlaretz, even in the West, is becoming more uncomfortable than it has been in the post-war years. But if you feel as I do, that you didn't run away, and you feel as I do, a certain amount of gratitude to the host culture in Britain or in America or Canada, Australia, whatever, that took in your ancestors and gave you a good education, whatever. I think there's a balance to strike here, because Hakar Tatov is a real Jewish virtue, a certain amount of gratitude. And also, I learned things from British culture that I'm pleased to have taken on board. There's a Rav Kook where he says, why do we say the Kapseinu Yachad Mi'arbatim Ha'Aretz? Why not just the Kapseinu Ma'arbatim Ha'Aretz, right? So it's the blessing in the Amida where we ask God to bring us back from the four corners of the world. Rav Kook's question is, why does it say bring us back together rather than just bring us back? And his idea is that it's not enough that we all just come back from our various diasporas. He says there are things that each of us learned in our diasporas. There are things that the Moroccan Jews learned in Morocco that the German Jews didn't learn in Germany. And there are things that the German Jews learned in Germany that the Moroccan Jews didn't learn in Morocco. And only if it's a Kapseinu Yachad, only if we come back together, will we teach one another the things that we learned from our various diasporas. So there are things that we may have picked up by being American or being Canadian or being British that are good things. So this is a very long way around putting a quite a simple point, which is we should try and strike a balance. On the one hand, we don't want to make Chutzlaretz feel like it's the home away from home, because that's very negative. It's always the grass is greener on the other side type of attitude. Oh, isn't life easy in the Hutz? If only we stayed in the Hutz. Clearly, that's a negative attitude to have. But on the other extreme, you could go to, oh, there's nothing good from America. There's nothing good in Britain. Okay, you've got something to be proud of. You're a bit British, a bit American. That's okay.
Yeah. Very important. Thank you for that addition.
Well,
so last point, because we're definitely this
last point, and
episode.
I'll see if I can come up with a half an hour detour on this one as well. Go on.
Okay, fine. The last is in terms of a practical point for people who are potentially getting ready to move and to make Aliyah. Yeah. Moving in general is difficult for parents and for children. The more that you can do to prepare for that psychologically and emotionally, the better it'll be for you and for your children. A lot of it is about the lack of knowledge, the uncertainty of what it's going to be like. So any way that you can try and make things a little bit more known to your children before you go, then that's better. If it's possible to go on a trip before moving, that's one way. But absent that, it's possible to, if you could get pictures of what the town is that you're moving to, or of the apartment, or videos so that they know what it looks like, the name of the school, what the neighborhoods, if there's a specific, depending on the age, there's a child that's their age, that lives in the neighborhood, trying to make some type of connection first, so that it's a little bit less unknown on the one hand. And on the other hand is also the importance of having a farewell from where it is that you're currently living, both as a process, right? Not just, throwing a big party before you leave, which also can be important, but also, well, okay, we're going to be moving. Who and what do you want to remember and take with you in a way when it is that we move? So when we did this when we went on shlichut to England for a couple of years, with the advice of a psychologist that we met with at the time, and we made a photo album for our oldest and asked her, who do you remember? So we took a bunch of pictures of friends. We were living in HaAtzmaut at the time, so we asked her, what places do you want in this album? So she said a whole list of different playgrounds and other places. So we took a picture of her in each one and put it in that album. And also her friends each made a drawing, and we took a picture of the drawing. So the drawings were very big, so we were able to put it in that album and take it it's in your bag with you, which helps you a little bit actualize that feeling of holding on to a little bit of all the meaning that you had where you were.
It was about 5, 6 when we made Aliyah from New Jersey, and she had things like that. She had a little at school they made her a little going away book where all of her friends had written something, and she had, but she remembers to this day, I used to go to school in New Jersey, and then all of a sudden one day I came home and everything had been packed away into a truck. That we felt we prepared her, but her memory, her lived experience was being completely prepared. All of a sudden everything's gone from the house, and they're just taking me to a foreign country where I don't speak the language. So of course that isn't what we did. We did make a parent, and in fact the school helped us. But I think that the fact that she could have experienced it that way only goes to emphasize how important it is to try to stage manage this in very deliberate ways. You sit them down, prepare them for every step of the way.
Definitely.
Literally.
Yeah, because
prepare them for the fact that furniture is going to be moved. Prepare them for every
Because if you reflect on it for a second, it's harder for us to realize we've been thinking about a move for however long. Oh, it was always my dream to make Aliyah, and already starting to think about it and plan it a long time in advance. And often it might not be relevant to talk to the children about it because it's not certain, and maybe it's not a good idea, but it's something that you've been thinking about and dealing with already for such a long time. And we sometimes make the mistake of, I forgot I have to. We need to tell them more than a week before we move to a
so for the
country.
child, they can feel like it's just being plonked on them. Completely out of left field, to use American.
All right. Thank you for joining us with this extended episode of Two Peas in a Pod.
It's great fun. Yeah. Well, a pod can be quite long.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, you use short pods where the peas are really squished in, but others, this was an expansive pod.
Yeah, an hour and a half. I don't know. We'll see. We'll see.
We'll see. All right.
See you next week.
See you next time. Bye.